Oftentimes when planning worship, I use what's called the lectionary that gives us 4 scripture texts to choose from each day. And some churches read all 4. We usually read 1 or 2. So we read one of them with the kids, and this parable today is the other one. And last week, the lectionary gave us a very difficult parable that we wrestled with, and one in which Jesus' message was a little bit murky. Today's parable is a bit clearer, especially if we pull away some of what could be a little bit confusing. So, first of all, this story is not about heaven versus hell. This is not a story about afterlife. And it's not even a story about our Hebrew Bible ancestor Abraham, despite his presence in this story. But instead, this is a story that likely makes us squirm. Or it might comfort us, depending on which ears we're using to listen today. So I'm going to kind of retell this story. So I want you to imagine this scene with me. And Jesus is teaching his disciples, so his closest friends, and anybody else who might be listening, parable or story after story. And he gets to this one. It's the 5th one in this long line of parables that Jesus is telling. So Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he says, "Let me tell you another story. Once there was a rich man in fancy, expensive clothes, who feasted on the most exquisite, delicious food every day. But just outside of his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus. And Lazarus was sick and starving and longed for just a scrap of food that was left over to fall from the rich man's table. But he got nothing. The rich man didn't even notice him. And what do you suppose happened when the tables turned? When Lazarus found himself healthy and fed with more than he had ever dreamed of, and the rich man knew pain and suffering and longing for the first time in his life. Jesus wondered, do you think the rich man wished he had treated Lazarus differently so that perhaps Lazarus would now help him? I can just imagine this disciples' just dead silence. And Jesus continued, "Remember what I've told you, and treat others the way you would want to be treated." Now that's not exactly how the scripture Amanda read says it, but that's the essence of this story. And this retelling sort of strips away some of that afterlife bit that we can sort of get caught up into. But I want to invite us through the telling of both of these parables to notice a few things. First, who has a name in this story? Lazarus. Not the rich guy. Not the one with power, but the nobody. The one nobody even noticed. Lazarus is the one with a name. Lazarus is the one that Jesus recognizes as somebody. Secondly, Abraham, right? There's a big presence of Abraham. And if we were an original hearer of this story of Jesus, we would have been Jewish. We would have known Abraham, we would have known our law and our prophets, and immediately been thinking about what the prophets said about loving your neighbor. And so just the mention of Abraham would have taken us on that path of remembering that we're supposed to love our neighbors. And so they would have been thinking, did this rich man live out the law to love his neighbors? They would have wondered if this rich man was in right community with his neighborhood. Nope. Not so much, right? He didn't know the guy's name. He lived at the end of his driveway. Not like down the street where you drive sometimes, but at the end of his driveway. Even the dog in the story that Amanda told notices this guy and helps lick his oozing wounds. The dog pays more attention. The stray, nasty dog on the street, right? These are not pets. These are like street dogs. That dog pays attention. The rich man does not. Third thing, I said, this is not a story about where we go when we die. It's not about heaven and hell. Instead, this is an invitation to think about how we live on earth. Right? We hear Lazarus saying, or not Lazarus, the rich man saying, send Lazarus to my brothers. Help them to see in their current life this side of eternity on earth so that they can live better lives now. So I don't know about you, but perhaps this story is making you squirm. We might be squirming if we identify with the rich man. If we find ourselves living lives of privilege, wherein we can kind of turn a blind eye to the needs around us. We can maybe turn a blind eye to the needs of, different parts of San Diego, different parts of the country, different places in the world. We can just kind of not see what's going on. But we might squirm because Jesus is pretty clear. That rich man is in agony. But we might also find ourselves comforted. Now, we might not be living on the street corner, but we might find ourselves struggling. We might take comfort in knowing that God sees us in our struggle. We might find comfort in knowing that God knows our name. Better than any creditor or anybody who's after us, God knows our name. And so if today we find ourselves identifying with Lazarus, we might get comfort in knowing that Lazarus has eternal comfort. And we might even feel a little bit of glee that the rich man knows agony. Because Jesus is clear. Lazarus knows comfort. American humorist and writer Finley Peter Dunne is credited with penning the phrase, "comfort the afflicted and afflict the comforted," some 120 years ago. Now, I didn't know this. I learned this as I was researching for this sermon, that this phrase came about from this guy who was talking about newspapers' role in society. But I think since then, it's been assumed by politicians, by educators, by lawyers, by preachers, by all kinds of people. But I'm suspecting that Dunn might have known the words of Jesus, because Jesus does this very thing time and time again. Jesus makes the comfortable squirm and comforts those who are suffering. So as followers of Jesus, that's who we are. We might just find ourselves squirming as we listen to Jesus' teachings. We might find ourselves taking a deep breath of relief when we hear Jesus' teachings. And because Jesus' parables do this to us, every time we read it, we might just have a different reaction depending on where we are. But as I started with, this story is not about afterlife, it's about now. It's about how we live our lives day in and day out. Do we notice the Lazaruses in our midst? Do we do what we can to make systemic change so that the lives of the Lazaruses among us are made better now, so that they don't have to wait until some afterlife for comfort. And how might we follow Jesus in hearing this story? Jesus' stories are made to stir and to nudge at us. So may this story nudge at you. May this story bring you comfort. May this story nudge you to action. But may this story change us. May it be so. Thanks be to God.